chapter 17. 1 Samuel, chapter 17. Well, you know the story, don't you? If you don't know this story, you don't know anything about the Bible at all. Most people who don't even know the Bible know this story. You know, this has always been representative in many kinds of literature, about the weak overcoming the strong, about the right overcoming the wrong. Everybody knows about David and Goliath, and everybody understands what is the theme of that particular story. But I'm going to suggest to you a different theme for this morning. A different theme. A theme that actually fits with the whole theme of the book of 1 and 2 Samuel. That God is king. God is king. And this story here is not about David and Goliath. Actually, this story is about David and Saul and their differing responses to Goliath. You have David on one side, who is acknowledging that God indeed is king and the difference it makes in his life. And then you have Saul on the other side, who does not acknowledge God as king and the difference that makes in his life. And we learn how we should respond to God as we look at this story and see the benefits and the warnings. Benefits that for those who will indeed acknowledge the Lord and serve Him and allow Him to provide for them and protect them, and those who will not, and the humiliation they suffer in the process. And so this story is the story of David and Saul versus Goliath. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soka in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Damim between Soka and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped at the valley of Elah and drew up their line of battle to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites the other, with the valley in between them. This is not an unusual battle formation. This is how things are usually done, where two opposing armies are on two hills and there's a valley in between, and where the battle is going to be fought. But we notice something happens here, something unusual, not mentioned other places in these kinds of battles. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp, and he was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore a coat of scale armor in bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. Just a little interpretation for you. That's 125 pounds. Ouch. How many of you wear clothes that weigh 125 pounds? I've had some boots that I felt weighed that much. But nobody wears that kind of heavy stuff. 125 pounds on his legs. He wore bronze greaves. And a bronze javelin was slung on his back. A spear shaft was like the weaver's rod. A weaver's rod, and its point, iron point, weighed 600 shekels. That's 15 pounds. For a spear point. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Well, there you go. It's a fighting machine. A 9-foot high fighting machine. And everybody knew it. And as Laura described it for us, boy, it was formidable, wasn't it? Everybody was looking at this and seeing on the outside. Remember that God had spoken to Samuel saying that I look on the heart. Men look on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. There is an aspect, there is something important, far more important than what we see on the outside, and that is what's going on in the inside of a person. And we see this in Goliath. Goliath is incredibly impressive on the outside. Now, let me tell you a little bit about his battle armor, in the sense that you will understand how this battle all comes together. First of all, the battle weapons that he uses are not long-range weapons. Philistines typically did not use long-range weapons. They trusted upon going in and confronting an enemy And they would use medium-range weapons, which would be the javelin that was across his back. You could throw that 20, 30 yards and probably have it's a good degree of accuracy. The big spear that he has, the size of a weaver's beam with a 15-pound point, you don't throw that far, right? That is something that's used for thrusting. It's sort of like, you remember the story of Robin Hood and Little John as they're vying for the possession of the log that goes across the stream. And they're fighting each other with the sticks that they have in their hands. This kind of a weapon was used that way as well as thrusting into the enemy. So that is not a long-range weapon either. It is a short-range weapon. Then you have the sword that he has slung across his back as well, which is curved in nature with sharpened on one side. And it depends upon him engaging an enemy, being close enough to him that he can swing it and cause damage. That is the nature of this. And he's expecting that a soldier from Israelites' army will come down and meet him on the battlefield, and they'll go at it together with the same sort of weapons. Israel typically did not have those kinds of weapons in those days. Philistines were the ones who had the monopoly on the smelting of iron, and they had the monopoly on the use of metals, and they would keep it for themselves and charge large amounts of money for the Israelites to be able to make things that they could use in their plowing and stuff like that. But generally speaking, the Israelites would use a bow and an arrow, both things made out of wood and a string made out of gut. Those were weapons that they would use, and they would use a sling at times. Not too much at this point, but here they have their whatever swords or sticks or sharpened staffs they are well outgunned here. And so, you know, the Philistines feel that they can kind of play around with him. And so they offer a challenge. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Well, choose a man and have him come down to me." He's saying, why are you coming out here to fight a whole army of Philistines if you're not willing to fight just one of them? Send out one of your best men and let us fight together. And this day I will declare unto you that if you win, and your person wins and I'm dead, we will be your servants, and vice versa. Now he's explaining this to them because this is not their normal way of doing things. Israelites didn't use this kind of form of battle. This was something that the Philistines used often here and there, then and again, but not always in their battles. But here he is explaining it to them and suggesting that they should try this on this particular occasion. It's really not that they were sincere about it. If they thought that Goliath was going to be killed, they would never have offered themselves as servants to these Israelites. And you saw that as Goliath was killed. They turned around and they ran away. I believe what they were doing was that they were humiliating the Israelites. They knew no one would come out and fight Goliath. So for 40 long days, they would come out and they would stand, and he would stand there and taunt them and humiliate them, shame them, and pretty soon they would begin to feel the same sort of things that he was saying they were. That they were cowards. They trembled and they were afraid. It says so in verse 11. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and they were terrified. So it was working. And Israel was losing their sense of courage and their ability to fight. And that's exactly what the Philistines were looking for. So David comes in verse 12. And he hears this. Now David and his son was the son of Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem of Judah. Jesse had 8 sons. In Saul's time he was old and well advanced in years. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, and the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep in Bethlehem. Now you remember that we read in the earlier chapter that David had been taken by Saul to play the harp for him. We're not certain how distant of times, how much later in time this particular episode is. It appears that David no longer is playing for him. In fact, it may have been years since he played for him. He started as a young lad, and then he grew older, but he isn't yet quite the age for fighting in a battle. He's not old enough to be a soldier. So this would explain at the end of the story why Saul says, who is that guy's father? That isn't known. They have to ask him. Well, over time he forgot. And David had changed, and he didn't look the same. You know how young men do that between ages 13 and 17 and 18. They change, and so perhaps that's an explanation for his asking those questions. But anyway, David hears what's going on. He's the youngest, and he's been taking care of his father's sheep. And then 40 days, it says, for 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. And David... Now Jesse said to his son David, go, take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. Unlike what happens with our soldiers, there is no support mechanism like we have in America. We send over many forces to provide food and provide support for those who are fighting in the battle. Here, the families of the soldiers themselves sent food on a daily or on a weekly basis to keep their children in food and able to fight. And they would also send food along to the company commander, and that's what's going on here as well, as David shows up because that is what he is doing. Well, so they are with Saul, he said, and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting the Philistines. So David provides care, first of all, cover for the sheep. He's concerned about his sheep. Early in the morning, David left the flock with a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse directed. And then he hears the challenge when he arrives. He reached the camp, and as the army was going out into its battle positions, shouting the war cry, Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, and he ran to the battle lines to greet his brothers, or he greeted them, and as they were talking, Goliath, the Philistine champion of Gath, steps out from his lines and shouts his usual defiance, and David hears it. When the Israelites saw the man, they all ran from him in great fear. They were just totally demoralized. Now, David's curious about this. Now, David is not used to this kind of thing. He is from a family that has been raised with the worship of God, knowing of God's power, knowing of God's glory, knowing the law of God, and he is used to hearing things unpraised to God. And here he hears this man, Goliath, come out and discredit God as if God was foul and useless and weak, and it bothers him. It really bothers him. So he hears the challenge. And then he hears Saul's solution. Now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man comes out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king, however, has a solution. He will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his father's family from taxes in Israel. This is interesting. Saul, who is a head taller, he is the biggest of all the Israelites, will not go out and fight Goliath himself. Now, obviously, even though he is a head taller than everybody else, he is no match for Goliath. But his solution is to send somebody else. If anybody else is crazy enough to go and fight this person, he will definitely promise him all kinds of things. Can't lose. If he promises all these things and the guy dies, well, he never has to give those things, I guess. But anyway, it isn't working. Nobody will go and nobody will fight. So David hears this, and he's trying to understand what's going on. He says, what will be done here for this person? He says, David asked the men standing, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes the disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? He says, there is something wrong with this. What will be done? Why isn't it that somebody isn't volunteering here? How is it that this Philistine can say these things and nobody responds? David is running these things through his head. This just is, what's wrong with this picture is what he's saying. They repeated to him what had been said, and this is what will be done. Well, word gets back. First of all, Eliab, his oldest brother, hears, and then he demonstrates why God never chose him to be the king, and he chose his younger brother David instead. He doesn't read people too well. He is very resentful for what David is saying. He thinks David is a coward, and he's just saying things in order to get involved, and he just shouldn't be speaking. Well, David was overheard, and it was reported to Saul, so Saul brings him in. And Saul says to him, David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." And Saul replied, "You're not able to do that. You can't fight this Philistine. You're only a boy, and he has been fighting men from his youth." Now let's step back for a moment and look at this picture. Remember I told you it is a comparison. It is a comparison between David on one side and Saul on the other. What we're seeing here, indeed, is a picture of the Lord Jesus as well in the process. David is standing before Saul and he's saying, "I can be the champion." Saul, because he looks on the outward appearance, sees a small young man. He sees a man without the skills of using weapons. He looks out into the field and he sees a giant who is 9 feet tall, well skilled in the use of all the weapons that he possesses. And what we see here emblemized for us is Satan, the accuser, standing before Israel saying, "You people are cowards. You are useless." And the people are listening to him. And they're beginning to believe what he says. It is much like what Satan does in our lives too. He is the accuser. He tells us that we are useless, worthless sinners, and we are guilty before God. And God will never really take us into heaven. And there's no way in the world that we can overcome what he says. He's too big for us. And what we need is a champion. And the champion who comes is one like unto David, who on the outside looks like just an ordinary person. What can he do? Remember back in Isaiah 53, where it says that the men looked upon him and they despised him. What is he? But he died for our transgressions. He was our champion. And as David overcame Goliath, Jesus overcomes Satan and his accusations against us. And he provides a way for us to find victory through him, our champion. David is that representation for us as we look at this story. "I will go." Saul looks at him, "Who are you? What can you do?" And David is saying, "I'm more than what you can see." Jesus was a human being, but he was much more than what you can see. He was also the Son of God. David was more than what could be seen because David was strengthened by God through his faith. The Spirit of God was dwelling within him, especially since the time of his anointing by Samuel. And so he stands before Saul and says, "Listen to me, I can do this. I can do this. And I'll show you how I know I can do this." There was a time when a lion came and attacked my flock. He carried off a young ewe lamb. I went after him and I took the lamb out of his mouth. And when he turned on me, I slew him and with my hands and my whatever club he had or whatever it was. He says, if I can kill a lion and if I could kill a bear, I can kill Goliath. Jesus did the same thing when he was here upon earth. He spoke about himself being the Savior of the world. He spoke of himself being able to forgive sins. Remember the time when they let down the man who was paralyzed on a bed in front of Jesus in this crowded area, and they had opened up an opening in the roof and they let him down in front of Jesus. Jesus said to the man, "Son, your sins are forgiven you." The Pharisees who were in the audience said, "He's blaspheming. How could he possibly say something like that? Only God can forgive sins." And then Jesus said, which is it? Easier to say that your sins are forgiven or to take up your bed and walk? Obviously, you think it's easier for me to say your sins are forgiven because nobody can tell whether they were or they weren't. But I tell you what, I can tell him to lift up his bed and walk. And you'll recognize that as a miracle, as an indication of who I am. And so he did. The paralyzed man rose and walked. So Jesus, through his miracles, again and again, raising the dead, healing the sick, overcoming elements of nature, demonstrated that he indeed was able to overcome sin. He could be the Savior of the world. He was the author of life itself. And so we see this in this comparison. Saul is powerless. He cannot do anything to solve this situation because he simply sees himself as in his own strength. He's taller than everybody else. He's king of Israel. He has authority, but he cannot overcome this giant. Here we have David, who is short and small, and he's young and he's inexperienced in battle. And yet, with God's help, acknowledging God as king, as his Lord, as Jesus did as well, he would be able to overcome this giant. And so, Saul says, okay, go ahead. Tell you what, you can take my sword and my armor, and you can go out there and you can fight him. Well, Saul dressed him in his own tunic, coat of armor on him, and a bronze helmet on his head, and he fastened his sword under his side and tunic, and he tried to walk around, and he couldn't. He said, I'm not used to this stuff. And so David indicates that he's planning here. He's thinking about, how am I going to approach this giant? He doesn't do it without thinking about it, and he knows that he cannot use a weapon that he has not tried and is not skilled in. So he sets those aside, and he goes out to the battlefield with simply a staff and with a sling. It's interesting that as Goliath begins to focus on this young man, Goliath finds himself totally insulted. He is so angry that they insulted him by sending out a young lad. What an insult. Are you saying to me that I am not worth fighting? The only thing that you send out here that you think could overcome me would be a little boy? You are insulting me. And so he swears at them. He curses them with his gods. Now, this is all part of the plan here. This is all that's intended to happen. David knows that these things are going to happen. He knows that he is going to be insulting to this man. And he's going to have to take advantage of a small window of opportunity if he's going to overcome the giant. Remember I told you that the giant has medium-range weapons and he has short-range weapons. That means that there's a place that David can stand that is outside the range of those weapons. He is himself carrying a long-range weapon. He has a sling that throws stones the size of tennis balls. A tennis ball is quite light, but if you make the same size thing into a rock and that thing hits you, it doesn't matter where it hits you, it will break something. So he has this long-range weapon that is able to hit things at 600 yards. This is a real formidable weapon. So he knows that he has this opportunity of getting out into the battlefield and going towards Goliath, and he has to launch this rock before Goliath has any opportunity to throw anything and get within range to throw the javelin at him. So, do you notice what Goliath says to him? Do you come out here? Am I a that you come out here with sticks? Do you notice that there's something missing? He does not see the sling. I think David is hiding the sling. He doesn't want him to have any idea that he is vulnerable. And so David comes running. That's another thing that totally surprises Goliath. I think Goliath sees him. He starts lumbering down the hill. And you're wearing 125 pounds of sheet metal. You're looking where you're going, right? I mean, you're not going to want to trip over something and roll on down the rest of the hill. It's humiliating enough to have to fight a boy. To fall on your face and doing it is terrible. So he's watching as he's going along. He thinks he's got plenty of time, before David's in front of him. In fact, he's thinking that when David gets near him, he's going to have to chase this little runt all over the place so he can finally kill him. Because he's just a boy. And as he's coming down the hill thinking about, what way am I going to kill this little guy? I'm going to just make him a mess. He's not thinking about what David's doing. David is now racing toward him for that particular window of opportunity where he is within range, but he's also out of range of Goliath's weapons. And as soon as he gets within that window of opportunity, out comes the sling, around goes the rock, and slam! It hits him in the head. As you read this story, did you feel like it was over before it began? Yeah. It was very short. You saw with all the detail that he had told this story in terms of all the armor and the weaponry and things like that. Very minute detail. There is no detail with respect to the fight itself in terms of like David started, moving from side to side. He was avoiding this or that because none of those things happened. He simply got within range, threw the rock, and down went the giant, just like that. I think that Goliath was so surprised when he looked up and he saw the kid running at him. First of all, that didn't compute. And then he looks and sees a sling coming out. He sees a thing going around. And all of a sudden he's thinking, I've got to do something. His shield bearer is standing there with his jaw hanging. That's all he's doing. He's supposed to be putting the shield up in front, and he doesn't do it. They're both surprised because David used strategy. He thought it through. And this is how it works. He told Goliath that he would win because of the power of God through him. But it did not stop him from having to think through exactly how he was going to do that. And he planned it well, and he executed it well. This is good lessons for us in terms of our serving God. Sometimes if we get on a real spiritual high, we recognize by faith that God is going to do great things through us in our Sunday school class, or perhaps in basketball as we're doing upwards, or whatever it might be. And we're thinking, God's going to use me. Hallelujah. This is wonderful. And that is a very important aspect of our serving God. But at the same time as we depend upon him, we need also to be planning and preparing for that. Now, David had been prepared a long time before this, as he had fought a lion, he had fought a bear. Those weren't the only animals that he had to endure and he had to fight against. How many other animals ran away with their tails between their legs or whatever they do? Because David had slung a stone and hit them really hard, and they were wounded badly. Because David, even though he had not known this, was practicing for this moment and many other moments later on in his life. There has been preparation in your life too. The things that you have experienced in your life were not just for naught. They weren't simply there and they just happened to you. God was working in your life, changing you, molding you for special moments. You have endured perhaps some real serious suffering in your life. Perhaps you have picked up some skills along the way that you seem to think are unrelated to the work of Christ. But God has prepared you for a moment like this or a moment like that. And this preparation is all part of His working. When it says that God will do this, it includes God has also been preparing for this. And then when we sit down and we plan out what's going to happen, that's also part of it. When I come up here to speak to you about a particular passage, you know, this is not the first time I've looked at it. You know, some people say that some pastors sometimes will just open the book and begin to preach. I remember a funny little tape that my father-in-law had about a man who just opened up the Bible and he began to speak about what he was looking at. And he says, "Oh yes," and he played upon the peasel tree. Peasel tree, yes. Peasel tree was a tree that grew outside of Moses' backyard. You know, he was starting on this message without even thinking about what it was about, or what the passage said, or any of those things. He just simply began, "I don't do that." I mean it. I shouldn't have to convince you of this, right? But also for you too, in terms of how you serve God. Whether it be in the kitchen, whether it be in taking the trash out, whether it be at work, planning is important. Now you say, at work I do the same thing every day. What planning is there required? I go in and I punch in and I do what I have always done. Or maybe you're saying that in my kind of work, you know, I don't know what's going to happen every day. But there are ways to prepare one's self. One of the indications that David was the right person for this particular job was because of his heart preparation. He was incensed that Goliath would have the gall to speak of the God of Israel the way he did. That came to him through many years of worshiping God, of knowing Him, reading the Torah, reading the Old Testament pages, and acknowledging them to be true, and living them out in his life, and trusting God in many ways in his life, and seeing God work. He was prepared, and he could plan in this particular process because of the preparation that was given to him. He had his mind set on what was truly real. There is so much that confuses us as Christians as we sit in front of the television set for so many hours. And it is telling us what its view of reality is. Reality for that which comes to us from that box is that you're important if you have the right clothes. You're important if you have the right car, or if you are impressive in your looks. We need to be continually refreshed in our understanding of what is real and what truly is important, so that then we plan as we enter into our day, "Lord Jesus, use me today. I'm heading off to work. Help me to be the person who does 8 hours work for an 8-hour job. Help me not to slough off. Help me not to make scrap today, but to be careful that everything I do is something that truly benefits the company. Make plans. Lord, today I want to talk to a friend of mine about you. And Lord, here's some things that I think I might want to say to them. They've told me about themselves, and here's what your word says about some of those things. Lord, give me an opportunity to use this preparation for you. Help me to plan it so that you will be glorified in it. And so David has a tremendous amount of things to teach us in serving God the way God desires us to serve Him. Let's pray together and ask the Lord to help us with that. Father, thank you that indeed you are the King. You are worthy of every aspect of our worship, our obedience, our service to you. Lord, where would we be if it weren't for you? Lord, when we think about the accuser like Goliath, when we hear him pointing out things in our lives that continually plague us with guilt, Lord, help us to turn to our champion, the Lord Jesus, to acknowledge that those things that we have done are true, and they do bring upon us guilt. But as we have confessed them to the Lord, and he has washed us clean with his blood, that guilt is removed, and we bear it no longer. How we thank you. Lord, there are many fights that we have in our lives these days with physical illness, with mental depression, with people that are hard to get along with situations that are very strenuous for us. Help us, Lord, to enter into the battle and to trust in you, lean upon you in prayer, believing that indeed you will carry us through. You've carried us through so many things. Lord, continue, we pray. Help us to trust you, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
So there we were, in Ephas Damim. Israel was camped on one mountain, and we were camped on the other, and the valley Elah was in between. We got all prepared for battle, and when all was ready, we brought out Goliath. You should have seen the looks on the Israelites' faces when they saw him. Nothing but sheer terror. We could see King Saul quaking from where he sat on the mountainside. Goliath was everything we thought he would be and more. He looked like a god of war towering above all. You remember what his armor looked like. He wore a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze greaves on his legs and had a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer walked in front of him. He was untouchable, and his ego matched his stature identically. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, "Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, then we shall become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us. I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Not one of all the Israelites moved. Not one of them said a word. They just stood and stared at the giant. And we smiled to ourselves and waited. They knew as well as we did that no one could ever defeat Goliath. For 40 days, Goliath challenged them, and no one met his challenge. Then, the next day, after Goliath had shouted to them, out from the battle lines came a man to fight him with a staff. But as he drew near, we saw he was not a man, but a youth. Was this the best that Israel had? You've got to be kidding me. This? Oh, we prepared ourselves for an even swifter victory than before. But Goliath was furious. From where I was standing, I could hear him as he bellowed, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? Come here and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." But the boy stood and looked at him and said, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. And this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. and I will give the dead bodies of the armies of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may see that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will deliver you into my hands. And Goliath moved to meet him, but he just came running. Then, out of nowhere, he pulls a rock the size of his fist and hurls it at Goliath with a sling. And before the shield bearer even knows what's going on, the rock plunges into Goliath's skull and he falls to the ground, dead. Then the boy moved over to Goliath and took Goliath's own sword from its sheath and cut off his head. And I just stood there. I couldn't move. But when the boy looked up, I caught his eyes, and fear filled my soul such as I have never felt in my life, and I ran, and I never looked back. I'm telling you all right now, I don't know if there is a God in Israel. But the next time we wage war with them, I will not be among the ranks. I'll take my own life before I face him again.